Glad all of you could be with us this evening. We're continuing our studies in the book of 1 Timothy, and in particular, we're in chapter 5. If you'd like to turn, please, to 1 Timothy chapter 5. We'll be beginning in verse 5 in just a few moments. We're studying the section of where Paul is instructing Timothy what, as a gospel preacher, he should teach about various groups of people in the congregation. We discussed how he should teach people to deal with older men, older women, younger men, younger women, and so on. But now we're in a section about widows, and probably the most complete section of discussion in the New Testament that I know of. It talks about how to care for widows, responsibility towards widows, and that's what we're discussing now. Before we read some of the material in the scriptures, I'd like to see if I can illustrate the idea of the different classes of widows that are described here. Now, like most illustrations, this one's not perfect, but it may help us understand some of what we're talking about here. First of all, I need to point out we're talking about needy widows. Obviously, then, like now, there are widows who don't have a financial need for whatever reason. But this is discussing how to care for the arrangements for caring for widows who are in need. And so if we look at widows in general who are in need, who has the primary responsibility to care for widows who are needy? Who's primarily responsible for them?
Their families.
All right, it's their family. And so we read back in verse 4 that a widow has children or grandchildren, they should be responsible to take care of them. However, there are other groups of widows that need to be considered. So we're going to talk about widows indeed, or sometimes, depending on your translation, those who are really widows, those are widows that are left alone. And the idea here is that not only because they're widows, not only do they not have a husband to provide for them, but they don't have children either. They don't have family. Family has the first responsibility when the husband dies to take care of the needy widow, but if she has no children or grandchildren, then she has no one to take care of. We'll discuss those. But then there's also, within that group of widows who are really widows, have no one to take care of, and there are those who are enrolled or taken into the number, which appears to me to be a specific group of the widows indeed. Beyond that, there's another group of widows he talks about, and that's the younger widows who are not enrolled, and what he talks about what they should do. They're younger, their teaching is different for them than for these older widows. So we have these different groups to be discussed, and sometimes it gets a little bit confusing, even for me, certainly for me. Hopefully it'll be helpful to you as maybe for the chart to look at. So let's look at the scriptures as we proceed and read the passage again before we go any further. Questions or comments anybody has before we read the passage of scripture? Daryl.
What was your distinction between widows indeed and the enrolled widows?
Let's talk about it when we get there. I think it has to do with the idea of a permanent arrangement, but let's talk about it when we get there. Okay, let's read it. Let's read verses 5 through, let's start with 5 through 10. We'd like to read 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 5 through 10, please. 1 Timothy 5, verses 5 through 10. Bill, please.
Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things commanded that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those in his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works. If she has brought up her children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved and afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work.
Okay, so first of all, notice in verse 5, he says he's talking about the one who is really a widow. That is, the widow indeed, depending on your translation. And so that's one category, as hopefully the chart can show, of needy widows. She's not one who has a family to take care of her, but we'll see that there's various characteristics. So let's talk about the widow indeed and the description that he gives of her characteristics And this is question number 9 in the questions. So what does it say about her? What are some characteristics of this widow, indeed, or really a widow, verses 5 and 6? What are some characteristics she has?
She's desolate, for one thing.
All right, the passage says she's desolate. So let's talk about that. She's desolate, and some translations say left alone, and we've discussed it. So this means what then? She's desolate, she's left alone. What? What's her situation?
She has no family.
All right, she has no family to take care of her. Whereas the children, grandchildren would be responsible. She has no children or grandchildren. So she's left alone. She's desolate. She's really a widow, not just a widow in the sense she doesn't have a husband, but in the sense she has nobody to take care of her. Now, his point is, and the distinction we're going to see, especially as we get to verse 16, is, well, then who is to take care of her? And the answer is that in many cases it would be the church to take care of her, okay, because she has nobody. Because if she had relatives, they should take care of her, not the church, okay? We'll talk more about it later. What are some other characteristics of this widow indeed? She's not only desolate or left alone, what else? What else does it say about her? Karen.
Well, she's spiritually minded. She trusts in God and prays night and day.
Okay, so it says that she trusts in God and she gives herself to prayer, supplication, and prayer night and day. What does that tell you about her? She's desolate, left alone. That's her physical circumstance. But what are we talking now? If we know that she trusts in God, or she sets her hope on God, and she continues in supplication night, what does that tell you about her? Debbie.
She's very spiritual minded.
Okay, so basically, to put it in a nutshell, we're talking about a faithful Christian. Okay, one who is dedicated her life to God. So physically, she's without anyone to take care of her. Spiritually, she's trusting in God because that's all she's got, God and his people. And then there's another characteristic about her in verse 6, a negative. What is she not to be? In question number 10, what is she not to be? Right.
Self-indulgent.
Okay. She's not to be self-indulgent. She's not to give herself to pleasure. The passage says if she gives herself to pleasure, she's dead while she lives. Now, how can you be dead while you're alive? What's that mean?
Dead spiritually.
All right, we're talking about spiritually dead, which means what? If you're spiritually dead, you're what?
Not faithful.
Not faithful? What else? See, I want to question number 11, and there's other passages that use this expression, someone who's dead even. So she's physically alive, that's obvious. You don't have to worry about providing for her if she's not. So she's physically alive, but spiritually then she's dead. So she's not faithful. What else is involved in being spiritually dead? Steve.
Being worldly minded.
All right. She's emphasizing pleasure. Okay. Other comments? Okay. Well, the idea of being spiritually dead specifically involves being separated from God. So when you're physically dead, James 2:26 says your spirit leaves your body. There's a separation between your body and your spirit. That's physical death. Spiritual death is a separation of your spirit from God. So Ephesians chapter 2 talks about it. The prodigal son, the father said he was dead, but now he's alive again when he repented. So the idea is Ephesians 2 that you're dead in sin, living in sin, you're separated from God, but then when your sins are forgiven, greater in the chapter he talks about once again, you have fellowship with God. You're no longer alienated from God, but you have a relationship with God and with God's people. So this widow, if she lives in pleasure, is spiritually dead. She's cut off from God. So the widow indeed then is one who not only has nobody to take care of her, but spiritually she's what she ought to be. She's faithful to God. She's trusting God, prays, worships, but does not live in sin and evil. Okay. Other comments on verse 5 and 6 and what it says about the widow indeed, the widow, a really widow. Okay. Now, Paul, it seems to me, interrupts himself. And he does this a lot, and we have to be able to follow him because he's going to come back to the widow indeed. He's not done with that because he's going to come back to verse 16. He's going to say that that's one who the church can support, those that are really widows and indeed. Verse 16. So it appears to me that this, if I go back to my chart, that this idea of widows indeed are those who the church could support because they have nobody else to take care of them, whereas if they had family, the family should take care of them. Okay? Okay. Back. Now, verse 7 and 8, he interrupts that train of thought to emphasize again those who ought to take care of their own. And first of all, in verse 7, he says these things should be commanded. So that's Timothy's responsibility. What he's telling these things is not just for Timothy for his own practice if his mother or grandmother was in need, but for what he should teach in the church. What all Christians need to know and understand about their responsibility towards needy relatives. But now in verse 8, he goes back to emphasize what he discussed in verse 4. What do we learn in verse 8 about the responsibility in providing for those physical needs of others? What does verse 8 tell us? In general, Frank.
Provide for your own, so that they're not a burden to the church.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah, if he's not providing for if a person's not providing for the widows, for their parents, then they're not in harmony with God's will, being an unbeliever of God's word.
Okay. So back to verse 4, those who are have a widow, they're in their family, a mother, grandmother, they're supposed to take care of them. But now in verse 8, we're told in particular, not just in regard to widows, as far as I can see, but here's a general principle, which we discussed this concept a number of times before. The Paul would teach a general principle and apply it to a particular situation. The principle is that a man should provide for his own, especially for his household. So what's the difference between providing for your own and providing for your household? What does it mean, provide for your own and especially those of your household? Steve?
Immediate family.
Okay. So providing for your own, that's your relatives in general. But providing for your own household, that's in essence those who live with you in your same abode. We usually think of it that way. So you have a responsibility. And as Frank pointed out, the consequences of it, if we don't do that, it's a denial of the faith, and we're worse than an unbeliever. Why would he say you're worse than an unbeliever if you don't do this? How can you be worse than an unbeliever?
An unbeliever will usually take care of their own.
Okay. That's not always the case, but generally speaking, even people who aren't Christians know that you're responsible to take care of your family. That you have a duty to do that, and in particular, the man who is the head of the household, which is the man, it's biblical, a man is the head of the household, he has the responsibility. He has to take care of the family to make sure that these needs are being met. So I ask you in these questions then, well, let's back up. First, question 13. What are some other passages that talk about the responsibility of men to provide for their families? What are some other passages that describe the fact that this is a man's responsibility to provide for his family? So himself and for his family. Some scriptures on this, question number 13. Terry.
Ephesians chapter 5, verses 28 through 33, and chapter 6, verse 4, carries with it the same idea of the father's responsibility.
Ephesians 5, you say?
Yeah. His responsibility, the husband should love their wives as their own body. no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ does the church. So the man shall leave mother and father and hold fast to his wife, the responsibility that a man has for his family.
Okay. So Ephesians 5, verse 28 and 29, it seems to me that, as far as I can tell, that's what he's saying. The husband ought to love his wife, take care of his wife, just as surely as he does for himself. Just as he would provide for his own body, he's to provide for his wife because she's part of him now. The two, they become one. And it's his responsibility to take care of her. It says nourish and cherish her. It's his responsibility, like the Lord does the church. So the Lord provides for the church, the husband provides for the wife, just like he does for himself. Okay? Other passages about the responsibility of the man to provide for his family. Any other comments? And if you go back to Genesis chapter 3 and the sin, record there of the sin, you remember that part of the consequences came upon the woman for sin, that she would bear children with pain and so on and be subject to her husband. Again, it's in Ephesians 5. But the man, with regard to him, it said that he would work with sweat and toil and thorns and thistles and so on. So the emphasis on working and to provide bread, that's it, that's in other words food. The emphasis on providing the bread, the food, is on the man. The woman, her emphasis is on the home, and we'll see that as we go through the reading here in 1 Timothy 5. So the man, and throughout the scriptures, you have all kinds of examples of men with jobs to provide income for their families. What are some examples of men, or jobs or occupations of men who might require them to even work away from their family, but to provide for their family? What are some examples of those kinds of occupations in the scriptures? Eddie?
We know that Jacob worked 7 years to be married to his wife and 7 more to get the one he wanted. So he worked a good long time.
Okay, so we have shepherds. Okay? And lots of shepherds in the Bible. And we have what else? Besides shepherds, we have fishermen, carpenters. Sure.
Musicians.
Okay. And even kings and preachers. And Luke was a physician. All kinds of, was that what you mentioned? So all kinds of different occupations in Scripture of men to provide for their families. Okay, so now, as you look at our society, question number 14 now. What are some applications here? This principle that if a man doesn't provide for his own, especially his family, he's denied the faith and he's worse than an unbeliever. What evidence do we have in our society that this is a problem? That there are those who don't fulfill their responsibility. Frank.
Well, we see around us that if parents, the father isn't providing for the physical and the spiritual welfare of the children, then they grow up not becoming servants of God that they should be.
All right, so when the father fails, being the head of the household and being responsible to provide for the family, if he doesn't do that, in many cases, if he's not doing what he should, he's worse than an unbeliever. In many cases, then his children don't turn out to be faithful either, which was what you would naturally expect. What else? What other examples, evidence do we see that this is a problem in society? Karen?
Well, lots of times men father children and then have nothing to do with them.
One of the biggest problems of our society is fathers who don't want anything to do except the physical union that results in the conception. And after that, he's gone. He comes and goes as he wishes, but he doesn't recognize a responsibility to those children and to the woman that he gave conception. That man is worse than an unbeliever. He is denied the faith, the passage says. Okay? Other examples of problems with this in our society? Sharon.
Well, it's related, but when parents divorce one another, a lot of times then the one or the other, but often the men don't stay in touch with their children the way they should and don't provide for them.
Okay, so divorce, which in many cases is wrong in and of itself, at least there's always sin involved. If there's a divorce, there's somebody's guilty of sin. And the children are the ones who suffer so much because of it. Sometimes, what often happens is then the father won't provide. He's not going to accept the responsibility for his caring for his family anymore. Okay? All right. And then there are men who get a job, quit the job. Get a job, quit the job. They won't continue to provide. They'll get a job, but then so any little thing that comes up, say, oh, well, they're this, the boss is mean, the boss does this, the boss, so they quit. And they don't continue their responsibility to provide for their family as they should. It doesn't matter what they may claim about their relationship to God. God says they've denied the faith. They're worse than an unbeliever. And then there are some men who maybe they stay on a job, they may even have a good income, but they still don't provide for their family. They spend the money on themselves. And the wife and the children are suffering because the man, though he has the income, he's not using it to meet their needs. He's buying his toys for his own pleasure. So our society has seriously gotten away from the idea that the man has a responsibility to provide for his family. And we need to emphasize that the Bible teaches this is what God says. Now we're going to see as we go along that the wife has other responsibilities. There's a distinction, but both have responsibilities that they need to fulfill. Sharon.
Well, our society also says that it doesn't matter which of the parents does the providing, and it's just as good if the woman goes out and gets the income and the man stays home with the kids or something like that, but the Bible says it's the man's responsibility.
All right. And we're going to see, again, as we go along, one of the points I want to make as we talk about the widows is even though he's discussing widows, he's discussing the kind of life they should have lived even before they became widows, which means there's lessons here for every woman, not just widows. But if you're going to be the kind of widow he describes here, it's going to start before your husband dies. Okay, so let's proceed unless somebody has something else on verse 8. All right, verse 9 now, we talk about a widow taken into the number. All right, so, and this is a question, and I'm not sure completely I'll be able to answer Daryl's question, but notice he's giving some characteristics of a widow taken into the number, or some translations will say enrolled. She says you have to be 60 years old, wife of one man, and then she describes the character that she should have had as a Christian. So, back to Daryl's question from earlier then, what would be the difference between a widow's indeed in general and a widow taken into the number? An enrolled widow. Now, she would obviously be a widow indeed. It's a particular kind of widow indeed. But besides the characteristics, why does God through Paul distinguish these widows from widows indeed in general? Thoughts on that? In other words, what does it mean for her to be enrolled or taken into the number? What's that mean? Debbie?
To me, that means she's being supported by the congregation.
Okay, that's definitely part of it. I think there's more to it. Because widows indeed, in general, verse 16 said widows indeed can be supported by the congregation. So it's that, but I think there's even more to it than that. Not just supported by the congregation, but supported by the congregation in what way? There's a difference. It has to be. Otherwise, there's no point in it if there's no difference. So she's supported by the congregation in what? Daryl.
I would add in to the idea of them being supported or honored, as verse 3 says, that they continue in entreaties and prayers night and day, that they in some special way, in some special capacity, because they've been enrolled or put on the list, that they spend time focused on prayer for probably for members of that church and any other things.
Okay. Other comments? All right, let me suggest this, and you can think about it. I don't know if I could absolutely prove this, but it seems to me that what he's talking about is that this widow, because she's the older widow, 60 years old, that basically she's not going to have any likelihood of anybody else ever being able to take care of her. Now, if she was maybe in her 50s or whatever, 40s, there might be some options maybe for her, but if she's 60 years old and she has nobody to take care of her, there's chances are there's nobody ever going to be able to take care of her. So the enrollment, it seems to me, to mean the church accepts the permanent responsibility for her on an ongoing basis. The church, not only are we going to, we're not going to just take care of her for here and there, or a month here and there, or even a few months, but we're going to accept the permanent responsibility because she's never going to have anybody to take care of her, and not at her age and under her circumstances. And because of the kind of woman she's been, she deserves that kind of honor. That's what it seems to me like it's saying. So not just widows indeed in general, which had no reference particular to age, but and more highly qualified. The widows indeed were basically just faithful Christians, as far as I can see. Trust in God, continues in supplication, doesn't live in pleasure. That's a widow indeed. But these widows taken into the number, what number? The number cared for by the church I believe, on an ongoing basis. But they have to have special qualifications, characteristics to do that. That's what I think. Other comments on the idea? Derek.
So the alternate view to that would be, because I don't see anything really that suggests that it's a permanent thing, that they've made this a permanent thing. Odds are maybe it's going to be, just because of the way life is, but I don't see any suggestion in the text that all of a sudden now he's talking about a permanent thing. And so I would see, beginning in verse 3 and on down, talking about the same category of women who've truly been left alone, further described as over 60, but from verse 3, honor them, they spend their time in prayer. So that's the alternate view.
Okay, the idea of that I use the word permanent, I know that word permanent is in there, but it's an ongoing thing, is in contrast to the younger widows in verse 11, who he says may desire to marry. Sure. But 60 years old and so on, the chances are they're not going to marry. So that the support of the church would be a more ongoing thing. That's where I got that idea. Okay? Anything else? All right, but Steve.
There's always that possibility that she could remarry too.
If she's younger, yes.
I mean, she could remarry to 60.
She could be, but not likely. And the point is that there's an understanding between her and my understanding is there's an understanding between her and the church that they're going to continue to take care of her. Okay. Okay. Any other discussion on it? But there's also she's a very highly qualified person as described here. This is not just any woman being described here. All right. So let's look at the qualifications then of this widow who is enrolled. What does it say about her? Beginning in verse 9. What does it say about her? Okay. So first of all, it said she's at least 60 years old. She's not to be under 60 years old. And she's been the wife of one man. Okay. What else does it say about her? Sharon.
Also well reported for good works, but I also wanted to comment on 60 years old. I think it's worth remembering that in the context when this was originally written, life expectancies were quite a bit younger, so we don't think of people as 60 the same way they would have. It doesn't change the application to today, but a woman back then at 60 would be even less likely to get remarried or something like that.
Okay. Yes. So she's well reported up for good works. Then he describes some of those specific good works. Okay. Other comments? What are some of the good works then? Well reported of good works. What are some good works that she's been well reported for? Terry.
She has to have brought up children.
Right, she's brought up children. Okay. And what else?
Strangers.
Lodged strangers. What else?
Wash the saints' feet.
Wash the saints' feet. And Bill.
Relieve the afflicted.
She's relieved the afflicted. And in fact, she has diligently followed every good work. Okay? All right. So, we're not talking here about a younger widow. He's going to talk about them in verse 11. And we're not talking about someone who has lived a selfish life. We're talking about someone who, now she's a widow. Now she has nobody to take care of her. And she has a lifetime evidence of a godly woman, of having lived the kind of life that God would want her to, and that therefore it would be appropriate for the church to take care of her. Okay? Let's discuss some of these responsibilities. And so I asked the question, and to me this is especially important. Question number 19. What lesson can you ladies learn from this? Other than the fact that we may have a few here who are widows, but suppose you're not a widow, and you're not 60 years old. So I'm not 60 years old, I'm not a widow. But what does this passage teach you? Because I think it teaches some very important lessons. What does it teach you? Terry.
Except for the responsibility to have brought up children, all women are not able to do that. But in every other way, it describes the life of a Christian woman.
Okay. To me, this is describing the kind of woman every Christian woman should be. Should strive. This is the goal for Christian women, to be this kind of woman. Now, this isn't the complete list of everything a Christian woman should do. I understand that. It doesn't talk about studying your Bible and so on. But although it did talk about prayer back in verse 5, but every woman, Christian woman, should strive to be this kind of woman. Eventually then, if the situation came to where she was a widow and had nobody to take care of her, then the church could provide for her. But even so, whether that ever happens or not, this is the kind of godly woman, the kind of woman a Christian should try to be. Okay? Other comments? Okay? Well, then let's move on. Let's discuss a little bit more about hospitality. I think most of the things other than that we pretty well understand. But question number 18, what is he talking about when he talks about hospitality, or depending on your translation, some say it's lodged to strangers. What is this discussing, and what are some other scriptures that talk about it? Question number 18. Frank.
The act of graciously entertaining guests in the home.
Okay. Other comments? Okay, taking care of guests, but in particular, we discussed hospitality with regard to the elders, if you remember our discussion there. And we emphasize that it's not just anybody, that any kind of situation where you have somebody in your home. That's nice, not necessarily wrong, but hospitality emphasizes a particular kind of situation, which would be what? Terry.
Taking someone in who is a stranger to you.
Okay, in this case, I believe especially strangers. Some translations say if she has lodged strangers, wash the saints' feet, that's other Christians, and relieve the afflicted, that's people in general. But where I was headed with my question about before was, I believe it's talking about, Derek, go ahead.
I was just I think this answers your question. It's not just when you help someone in your home, But when you see someone who needs something that you can do for them, that's the love of a stranger. It may be in your home, it may not be in your home, but you can do something for them.
Okay, and again, the emphasis on a need, a situation where you're helping somebody who has a problem. It's not just you've got some friends you like to have over. You come to our house this week, and we'll go to your house next week, and we'll play games together. That's not wrong necessarily, but it's not the emphasis of biblical hospitality. Biblical hospitality emphasizes you're doing this to help somebody who's got a need, a problem. And so it may be a stranger, saints. Washing the saints' feet is very similar to hospitality, but it's the emphasis for the saints in this case. And those who are afflicted in general. She's relieved. This has been the focus of her service to God, her family, and helping people in need. Okay? Other comments through verse 10 and discussion on this enrolled widow. Anybody? Karen.
Well, Paul certainly mentions several women in Romans 16 as he ends his letter. Phoebe, who was a servant of the church in Centuria, he said, receive her in a worthy manner, assist her, because she's been a helper of many but myself. Priscilla and Aquila, who risked their lives for Paul. Greet Mary, who labored much for us. I think this is what he's talking about.
Okay. Other comments? It's when you look at other Bible examples, you think of Dorcas and these kind of people in the scriptures and the care that they gave to people in the need. So the focus, as far as I can see, for a godly woman is taking care of her family and taking care of people with needs. And of course, worship to God, back to verse 4 and so on, her relationship with God. But if she has that relationship with God, this is her relationship with people, her family, and people in need. All right. Let's see if we can cover at least some of verses 11 and 12 then 11 through 13, before we close. Who'd like to read 11 through 13 for us, please? Verse 11 through 13. Who'd like to read that for us, please? Tim.
But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith, and besides they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Okay,
so verse 14 talks about what they should do in contrast to this situation, but what does he say about the younger widows? Now, we talked about the widows indeed. We talked about the enrolled widows. Now we're going to talk about some younger widows. Okay, so what's the difference here? What does he say about the younger widow? Debbie.
She's begun to become wanton.
Okay. So he says, notice he says, refuse the younger widows. And I believe that's in contrast to the enrollment. Rather than don't enroll them, because if you do, you might get some problems. She's not in a situation yet where she's ready to be enrolled. So refuse them, don't enroll them. And the situation is that, as he describes, they may be wanton against Christ, and in particular, may desire to marry. Now, what he's going to say in verse 14, that getting married is what they ought to do. So then, don't enroll them, you see. Don't put them in this situation. This is what I think. The church has an agreement with her. We're going to take care of you from now on, because she may not want that relationship. It may not be good for her to remain in that relationship. It may be better for her to get married and have a family relationship and so on. Okay? But what kind of problems can happen if the church accepts the responsibility of caring for a young widow? Verse 12 and 13, what are some bad things that can happen if the church does that? What are some bad things he says that might happen? Sure.
All of of her needs are provided for, but she doesn't have any responsibilities anymore, then she has a lot of time on her hands, and sometimes that can lead to trouble, either because she's just getting into everybody else's business because she doesn't have any of her own business, or maybe even becomes unfaithful or something like that. So I don't think it's saying the church can never help her, but encourage her to do what she can for herself and keep herself busy with good things and providing for herself if she can.
Okay, so I want to come back to Sharon's point that this doesn't mean the church could never provide for her. That's not the point. That's why, again, I'm back to that enrollment thing. This is not an ongoing thing. But before we go to that, if the church provides for a young widow, it may not always happen, but some of the problems that might happen is that they may become idle. He says in verse 3, wandering about from house to house, gossiping, being a busybody, saying things they ought not, because she's got nothing else to do. She's got an income, she's being provided for, but she doesn't have a family. Because if she had a family, they would be responsible for her. So she doesn't have a family, she doesn't have a husband, she doesn't have children, she's got no responsibilities, but she's got an income, she's being provided for. So she's very likely to get involved in things she shouldn't. What are some other things that may happen with young widows? What are sometimes, hopefully not among Christians, but what are young widows sometimes known for? Nobody knows what young widow. Oh, Frank.
Are you talking about getting involved in evil speaking or vain talk?
That's
idle talk.
Okay, that's part of it. That's verse 13. But they can also become sexually tempted. They're still young. They're still attractive to men. And so it's maybe I'm not, maybe other people haven't heard about this, but hey, young widows sometimes are known to be on the look for a man. And men sometimes are on the look for women like that because they're still young, they're still attractive. So there can be a sexual issue as well. But if they've got no responsibilities, the church has provided for them, then they're much more likely to be involved in things they shouldn't be. So he has the solution for it in verse 14, which we'll talk about next time, what they ought to do instead of receiving this support from the church because of what they could get involved in that they shouldn't be. All right. Not necessarily an easy section, but any questions or discussion anybody has through verse 13 before we close? All right. Lord willing, we'll take up in verse 14 next time. Look a little bit more about the younger widows, and then we'll move on down through the discussion, or hopefully close the discussion of widows through verse 16, and then look at some other relationships he talks about later on. Thank you.